I know, it's like freezing. See if I can do it. All right, so this is a narrated PowerPoint, and as many times as I hit pause on it, it doesn't ever pause, so I'm gonna just have to like scroll through it so it's not, so that it doesn't have my voice and things like that on it. So I apologize, I can't figure out why it won't do this. Today we're gonna talk about why we should study ethics in marketing. And one of the things that happened when I first started asking to teach this course was the dean at the time told me our students need substantive skills that they can go out and say that they have acquired that will allow them to prove their worth towards getting a job. And ethics doesn't provide those kinds of substantive skills. And I disagreed with that from a number of perspectives. But I did say, like, yes, it does seem to be more subjective. It does seem to be more nuanced. And so it's not like answering the question, what is 2 + 2, right? There's a joke about accountants, and the joke goes like this. A very wealthy man goes in to hire an accountant, and he says, I need to hire a new accountant. Mine has just died. But before I hire you, I've got to ask one question. And the accountant says, what's that, sir? And he says, what's 2 + 2? And the accountant says, 4. And he gets up and he leaves. So he finds another accountant, and he says, I need to ask you a question before I hire you. And the accountant says, what's that, sir? And he says, what's 2 + 2? And the accountant says, 4. He gets up and he leaves. He goes to a third accountant and says, before I hire you, I've got to ask you one question. What is 2 + 2? The accountant gets up from his desk. He walks over to this window. He closes the blind, shuts the door, and says, what do you want it to be? And so ethics seems to be that kind of what do you want it to be kind of area rather than 2 + 2 = 4. And then something happened. Enron, one of the largest, sort of corporate scandals in modern history, and that's been followed by numerous others. So at one time, Enron was the 7th largest Fortune 500 company. And on December 2nd, 2021, which is a long time ago, they filed for bankruptcy protection. What Enron was doing was they were creating what were called special project entities that were transferring the debt from their books into these special project entities. And so it looked like Enron was in better financial shape than they were. One of their executives decided to sort of blow the whistle on this, and she came forward, and as a result, Enron tanked. So senior executives, while this was happening, made fortunes while dumping their stocks while their own employees were locked out of their 401ks. So they couldn't trade and make adjustments. And many of these people went from being millionaires to being broke overnight in the amount of money that they lost. They had invested everything in their 401ks in these in Enron stock, and it went from being highly valued to being worthless overnight. And all of a sudden, this dean who I had been talking to about offering this class came to me and said, that class you've been talking about that you want to offer, maybe we should think about that. And AACSB started requiring that we teach ethics. Now, there are 2 ways that we can do this. According to AACSB, basically we can offer dedicated courses in ethics, which we do in marketing and they do in accounting, or you can include ethics as a component of every course that you offer. And the problem with doing it as a component of every course that you offer is that it's often given short thrift in those courses. It's not covered in depth the way it is in a fully, submersive one semester class. So I think one of the things that we've seen, and after Enron, there have been other scandals that have occurred in terms of the subprime mortgage industry, where, and this was a huge marketing failure. You had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac basically stop requiring that you have fully documented loans on mortgages, and they were allowing for subprime mortgage industries to pop up where people could state their income. And with that stated income, they were making loans of hundreds of thousands of dollars on properties that people really could not afford. And that was all fine as long as the home market was financially, sound, and people were paying more and more money for homes. But the minute the market crashed, they were underwater in these loans and they defaulted on them. They couldn't refinance them. They had adjustable rate mortgages, and it led to a huge crisis in that industry, huge numbers of bankruptcies and foreclosures, and people, lost their entire net worth basically in their homes. So why should we study ethics in marketing? Given the fact that business has become increasingly complex, highly specialized courses in marketing demand larger and larger portions of our curriculum. So for example, the latest trend in marketing is to offer things like social media marketing, right? We used to offer a course called advertising. We no longer offer that course. It's called Integrated Marketing Communication, and I teach that course. And one of the things that we recognize is that it's not just about putting ads together in newspapers, magazines, radio, television. You've got to meet consumers where they are. And so what's been the biggest movement away from newspaper magazines? A lot of newspapers have gone broke over the last, 10 years. Well, it's to social media marketing, which allows you to be interactive with your the companies that you're doing business with, right? We're allowing for mass customization. The experience is now highly tailored, and we can engage in what's called micro marketing, right? Where we target populations based on very specific demographics. So ethics seems to be not as relevant, given the fact that we need these substantive skills. How do you go about engaging in micro-targeting? Well, it's using big data to figure out exactly what it is that people want. If you don't have a Facebook account, Facebook has thousands of data points, I think I talked about this last time, on you, even if you don't have a Facebook account, right? They know where you live based on publicly available information, things like home sales, records, the sort of rewards programs that you opt into, which are sold to Facebook, that data, and they know what you buy. One example was Target had figured out, and I think I mentioned this last time, what women buy if they're pregnant. And there was a young woman who had bought all of this stuff, and they started sending her ads or flyers for pregnancy sort of things. And her father became very upset, went to Target and said, "Why are you sending these to my daughter? Because she's not pregnant." It turns out she was, and she hadn't told her family yet, right? It was a teenage pregnancy. That kind of data is enormously powerful. And so what does philosophical ethics have to offer in an era in which this is increasingly more and more data driven and objective, whereas ethics seems to be subjective? Well, I would argue that ethics is not necessarily subjective, that it is actually objective. And it answers three great questions which are relevant to all societies in all places at all times. The study of philosophy deals with the questions of knowledge. What is it I can know, and how can I know it? Now, there's two subfields of philosophy that deal with this. What is it I can know is epistemology. And what is real is metaphysics. So the study of knowledge. What is it I can know, and how can I know it? Are these things that we think we know real? So if I ask you a simple question, what is this that I'm leaning on? It's a what?
Table.
You think it's a table? Why do you think it's a table?
Because that's what I was taught it was, a table.
You were
Like that's
taught
what-
that it's a table?
Yeah,
What makes it a table?
you can sit things on it.
Okay. Table, oh, you
and-
can only set things on tables?
No.
Why isn't it a desk?
Because you can set multiple people around it instead of just one. I guess you could do that with the desk too.
You can do that with a desk. There are these things called partners desks that were made for two people. So, like, if you come to my office, you can sit around my desk. There are chairs in front of it. So what makes this a table and not a desk? I think it's a desk. I think this is a desk and not a table.
I feel like a desk in my head just has more like, I don't know, it's just longer and it just seems more like a table in my head.
Maybe it has compartments,
Yeah.
A
Like-
desk what?
has compartments to store things
Okay, so tables don't have compartments to store things?
usually.
What?
Not usually.
I have a 600-year-old French farm table in my house that has drawers in it. So you can store stuff in the table. Usually it was utensils. That's what people put in the drawers in this table. Is this tables are usually made for eating, right? Are you gonna eat on this?
Probably not.
No. You're using it as a desk, aren't you? You're using it to write, to take notes, to put your computer on. So why isn't it a desk? Does it matter what it is? I think it does. If we can't agree on the most basic of things, whether or not this is a table or a desk, how can we possibly come to any agreement on whether or not, murder is wrong? When I was younger, I was, like most little boys, kind of aggressive. And if somebody like upset me, I wanted to like get in a fight with them. And I wanted to destroy them, right? That's not atypical of young men in, the teenage years to have these kinds of feelings of rage as you're going through, sort of hormonal changes. And I thought I knew who the bad people were, and I thought I should be able to destroy them, right? We don't let you do that in society, because if you do, it's chaos. It becomes a war of all against all. So, but why is that wrong? Why is it wrong for me to just be able to decide who the evildoers are? Well, because that's just not the way things work. But what makes it so? Is it societally bound, or is it something more than that? So if we have a hard time deciding whether or not this is a desk or a table, how can we get to more fundamental issues that have moral import? Whether or not this is a desk or a table has very little moral import. But whether or not I should be able to extract or enforce rules and engage in punishment is far more nuanced, right? And if we're going to have a hard time dealing with whether or not this is a desk or a table, how do we get to that sort of thing? So the question of knowledge is enormously important. It's not just that we think we know things, but how do we know them? How can we know what it is we think we know? Well, there's two ways that we can sort of come to know things. We can figure things out, and a lot of ethics we're going to figure out a priori. This is knowledge that is based on the rational mind. You only have to think it to know it. If I said, and I think I did this last time in here, if I have a rectilinear triangle, a right angle triangle, and this side is 3 and this side is 4, the third side has to be what? 5. How did you get that? The Pythagorean theorem, yeah. So 3, 4, 5. Did Pythagoras go around drawing triangles in the dirt? No. This is something you can know with the rational mind. Now, it helps that he was a genius, right, to come up with this. But it's something that you can figure out a priori, as opposed to a posteriori, which is knowledge that has to be gained from experience. This is like riding a bike. No one instantly knows how to ride a bike. You all have ridden a bike, I hope. I mean, it's kind of incredible to me how many people nowadays don't sort of engage in things that we engaged in for years and years and years as a child. Like riding a bike is one of those sorts of rites of passage, but I've got students that tell me that they've never learned to ride a bike, because why would you do that? You've got everything you need. Like when I was a kid, you learned to ride a bike, and that was part of freedom. Like you could get out of your house and go visit your friends. Parents no longer let their kids just ride bikes around because they're terrified that they'll get run over or they'll get kidnapped or things like that. But you learn to ride a bike. It's not something that you can learn through the rational mind. It's something that has to be experienced, right? You have to experience this. It takes time. You get on the bike and you wobble around and you fall over, probably. I didn't learn to ride a bike with training wheels. That was something that was, for later generations to do. I guess they kind of had training wheels when I was a kid. My parents didn't really. They just bought me a bike, and you learned to ride it by falling over, and that was sort of the way. But you wobble around, and you have to learn it through experience. So a lot of ethics we can figure out a priori. Things like you don't have to experience death to know that you probably don't want to die, right? And so if I don't want to die, it's probably wrong of me to kill somebody indiscriminately. And we have moral prohibitions that are written into the criminal law that say, don't kill people. In a book called Candide by Voltaire, he discusses this. There's, in this book, it's not a novel, really. It's this sort of series of unfortunate events. So Candide is the protagonist of the story. He falls in love in the kingdom of the Baron of Thunder Tan Trunks. the Baron's daughter named Cunigond, and as a result of experiencing this lust for her, he gets thrown out of this garden of paradise with literally powerful kicks on his rear end by the Baron. And he spends the rest of the book trying to get back with Cunigond. At one point, so he goes through all of these trials and tribulations, and at one point, he's reunited with her, and they come across this old woman who's sort of wretched and miserable and not very attractive. And they start discussing their trials and tribulations and whether or not they have a harder life than she does. And she says to Cunigond, "Mademoiselle, if you saw my rear end, you would not speak so, and you would not think that you were worse off than I was." And Cunigond says, "Unless you've had 2 lovers executed in an auto da fe, been, whipped and beaten, had both your mothers and fathers killed before your eyes, I don't know how you get the better of me." Well, the old woman starts to tell her story, and it turns out that she was the daughter of a pope, and she was engaged to be married to a prince, a very handsome prince. And as they set sail to send her off, she gets captured by pirates, and they go through a horrible storm, and she's wrecked on a beach with these pirates. And in order to survive, they cut off half of her butt in order to survive. They eat her butt cheek as a survival method. And so she is then sold into slavery after they're rescued. And she goes through all of these things. And she says, through all of this, through all of these trials and tribulations, as much as I wanted to die, I went on loving life. People live in the most horrible conditions, and they continue to love life. You don't have to experience death to know that you probably don't want to go there, right? And so we have this moral prohibition against murder. In the United States, at the common law, murder is defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. This is what we call an elements test in law. You have to meet every element of the test in order to be found guilty of the crime. And this is based on morality. Our criminal code is largely based on morality. But there's lots of things that I can do to you that may not be criminal that we still think of as being immoral. I could decide that I just don't like you and I'm going to fail you, right? And you have no criminal recourse against that. Let's suppose you do well on all the exams and you write the paper that I assign and hear an article review, and I just decide you're going to fail. What's your recourse? Well, it's not criminal law, right? So there's lots of things that are not necessarily legal, but may be immoral. So the law is an important part of this consideration, but it doesn't cover everything, which leads us to questions of governance. How should we decide what it is that we're going to criminalize? A big portion of how we define ourselves in society is based on criminal law. So forever and ever and ever in the United States, for example, homosexual sodomy was criminalized. How do you enforce that? It's very difficult. In a case called Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, the Lawrence decision overturns a case called Bowers versus Hardwick. And Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986 the United States Supreme Court said that states could criminalize homosexual sodomy. And the Chief Justice writing in Bowers versus Hardwick says that to say that we can't criminalize that goes against 5 millennium of moral teaching. Then we get to the 2000s, and in Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, the Supreme Court says you can't criminalize that. So a big portion of who we are as a society is predicated on what we choose to criminalize. But there are lots of things that I can do to you that are not necessarily criminal. You could ask me for a letter of reference, right? And you could have done well in my class, and I just decide I don't like you, and I give you I write a poor letter to your prospective employer, and that could harm you. And do you have a case against me in criminal law? Probably not, right? So questions of governance are enormously important. And then questions of conduct. How do we decide what is or is not moral with or without respective to the criminal law or to tort law, things like that. So philosophy answers these 3 great questions. What is it I can know and how can I know it? Which is epistemology. What is the meaning of reality? Metaphysics. And what kind of governance is appropriate? In the United States, we believe that democracy is, now we're real light on democracy, by the way, but we believe that democracy is the best form of government. We should have a vote and a say, and we elect people to represent us. Now, in reality, we have a Republican form of government, and I don't mean Republican in terms of representative democracy. I mean a Republican form of government as in sort of the Roman Republic, which is what our founding fathers established. They really were kind of skeptical, if you wanted to know the truth, about democracy. But they thought that the people should have control of their government in various ways. But there were safeguards in a Republican form of government. In a Republican form of government, in the ancient sense of the word, republicanism, as in the Platonic sense of the word. In Plato's Republic, what you have is you have elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of polity, which is what they called will or governance by the people, right? What is the elements that we have? Well, you don't directly elect a president. When you went to the polls and voted this last election cycle in 2024, you didn't actually vote for an individual. You voted for a slate of electors, which is equal to the number of representatives and senators that a state has, and those people vote for president. It's called the Electoral College. Senators don't represent people, they represent states. And initially they were not elected by the populace, they were elected by state legislators. The only branch of government that's truly democratic is the United States House. There are 3 branches of government. There is the executive, which carries out the laws, the legislative, which writes the laws, and the judiciary, which interprets the laws. At a federal level, all federal judges are appointed. They're not elected. So only 1/2 of one branch of government is actually democratic. It's the United States House of Representatives. So these questions of knowledge and governance and conduct come up all the time. How should we organize ourselves? Why should we care about this in the study of ethics? Well, I think that answering these 3 great questions makes you better at making arguments that ultimately will help you in marketing. right? And we find that companies that engage in ethical behavior are ones that people want to do business with. And so it's beneficial to engage in these kinds of debates. What's the difference between values and ethics? Values are beliefs that incline one to act, and we all have lots of values. This is largely based on culture in many respects. Are we different in Oklahoma than people? We can talk about a national culture that we have in the United States. What are some of the things that are part of our national culture, would you say? What makes us different from the British as part of our national culture?
Independence.
Okay, Independence Day. Why is Independence Day important? What separates us in independence from the British?
Because in our interpretation of that day, that's when we earned our freedom, whereas their interpretation is that they lost a major part of their, how much money they have, and later, their colonies. So it's a coin flip there.
Okay, so what makes us different than the British in terms of our governance that we wanted to get away from? What did the British have that we didn't want?
They had that we didn't want,
Yeah.
taxation.
Okay, well, we tax, right? The federal government taxes you. You're taxed. If you have a job, you'll get something called probably because anybody get a live check anymore? Nobody gets a live check. How many of you have a job? Everybody has a job. Are you direct deposit? Everybody in here direct deposit? Nobody gets a live check. By live check, I mean that something that you have to take to the bank, which you don't have to take to the bank anymore because we now have online banking where you can take pictures of your checks and deposit them in your checking account. I have a young lady I have a business on the side, and she works for me in this business. And I signed a check and told her to go get something from the hardware store, and she had no clue how to fill out the check. Didn't know how to fill out a check. I thought it was sort of self-explanatory, but no clue as to how to fill out. She comes back and she said, I can't do this. It's like, oh, what? She's like, I don't know how to do this. She also didn't know how to address an envelope. You all have addressed an envelope, hopefully. So we tax. So as going back to the check thing, if you get a live check, you also get something called a pay advice. And if you get a direct deposit, they'll send you a pay advice, probably electronically now, and or online. You could look it up, and it gives your earnings, right? Your gross pay, and then there are various deductions that are taken out. And one of those things that's taken out is federal income tax and state income tax. And what else is taken out of that? FICA, payroll taxes, right, are taken out of that. So we tax. Why was it that the Americans were adamantly opposed to the taxes that British government imposed? Well, they were imposed by a parliament to which we had no vote, in the name of a king that we didn't elect. And so we had this idea of no taxation without representation, right? The United States has citizens. You are part of the body sovereign of the United States. The British have subjects. To this day, citizens of Great Britain are the subjects of the monarch. Now, does the monarch have any real power? Well, depends on how you look at it. The monarch hasn't really exercised sovereign prerogative in terms of vetoing legislation that's been passed for, several hundred years as a result of a series. But in theory, he could, right? So that makes us American. We don't want a king. We don't have titles. This is in the United States Constitution. That we don't have grants of hereditary titles. Right? So that's part of our culture. That's part of our values. The British like having a monarch, at least according to public opinion polls, they support the monarchy. Now, they supported it more when Queen Elizabeth was alive than they do now that her son, King Charles, has taken over. But that's part of their culture, right? And part of their values. This belief in a hereditary ruler, which we don't have. Most successful companies have a core set of values. In a book called Built to Last, an author named Parias and his fellow authors list the fact that the most successful companies are ones that are built on a set of core values. Now, you don't have to have good values. One of the companies that they say is built to last is Philip Morris. How many of you know who Philip Morris is, what Philip Morris is? Nobody in here knows what Philip Morris is. They manufacture cigarettes. Some of the most popular brands, I believe Marlboro, for example, is a Philip Morris product. And the executives at Philip Morris were described as being ruthless. The CEO of Philip Morris was quoted as saying, "I see nothing wrong with selling people a product that they do not need, that they only desire." Well, there's a difference between selling a product that people want and selling one that's actively harmful, right? It's not just that cigarettes are a non-necessary item. They are actively, like all kinds of stuff happens if you smoke. That's bad. None of it's good. It increases your chances of lung disease, emphysema, heart disease, cancer, and not just lung cancer. We're finding out that it contributes to all kinds of different cancers, right? In men, it increases the risk of prostate cancer. In women, it increases the rate of breast cancer. So it's bad, right? So we don't have to have good values. We just have to have values. So how do we determine what are good values and what are not necessarily good values? Well, that's the business of the philosopher and the ethicist to say what is and what is not a worthy value to have, right? A lot of people argue that the law is the moral minimum. The law is the floor, and it's an acceptable moral minimum. The problem with this argument is that the law is an important consideration. So if we think about the law, and in particular, criminal law or tort, there are things that are legally actionable in various forum. So courts of law and courts of equity can enforce things like the criminal law. The unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought is based on a higher moral principle, right? Thou shalt not steal is part of the criminal law. right? It's defined at the common law as the unlawful taking away of chattel properties of another, right? And so we have these elements to it, like the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. These are the actus reus. This is the mens rea, the guilty mind part of the law. But there are lots of things, as I've suggested to you, that I could do that are not necessarily illegal or even subject to tort, but maybe immoral. Again, going back to, you asked me to write a letter of recommendation for you, and I write this letter of recommendation, for a job, and I say, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so was in my class, and in my opinion, they exhibited, sort of a lack of intellectual curiosity and low moral character. Can you sue me for that in tort? You don't get the job. Can you sue me? You can sue me. Are you going to win? Why not? You're shaking your head no. Why?
You asked for the recommendation.
You asked for the
You
recommendation.
didn't ask specifically what you would want on it. You
Okay.
just asked me to write a paper for you.
Okay.
How am I supposed to interpret whether you want something good or my honest
What
opinion?
if I said instead of I think you are of low intellectual capability and poor moral character, what if I said, and you're a known felon? Could you sue me then?
If it's not true, maybe defamation.
Okay. What makes that objectively not true or true? Which part of that? I mean, if I say that you have low intellectual capability, what part of that is objectively verifiable?
felon. Do you have a-
The felony. Yeah. Okay. So that's the part that's objectively. Why is intellect not objectively verifiable?
Because it's an
That's your
opinion.
interpretation.
Okay, it's an opinion. Why is it an opinion? What makes it an opinion as opposed to a fact? I have these, I do animal rescue. And I have these prairie dogs that I've rescued. I've rescued all kinds of animals over the years that have been injured or, trapped somehow. Lots of squirrels, tree squirrels, a couple of raccoons. And most of the time, we release these back into the wild after they've been rehabilitated. But sometimes you can't release them. So I have these two rehabilitated or rescue animals now that are prairie dogs. Outside of humans, prairie dogs have the largest language set of any animal known to man. They've done studies on prairie dogs. They speak with adjectives and adverbs. The way we know this is they record the sounds that prairie dogs make in the wild, and they will have certain conditions. So they'll have a man, for example, that will walk through a prairie dog village and he'll be carrying a gun. And then they'll switch it up and they'll record all of the yips that the prairie dog makes. And then they'll have him walk through without a gun. And the vocalizations change. So we know that they know whether or not he has a weapon. They'll also have a guy walk through who is skinny and one who's larger. And the vocalizations will change between skinny and larger. They recognize color. Highly intelligent creatures. But are they as intelligent as I am? Well, probably not. I don't know. right? Intelligence is a spectrum. So if I say you're not very intelligent, well, compared to what? Compared to Einstein, I'm probably not very bright. Compared to a prairie dog, I'm pretty bright. Right? It's a matter of, it's not an objective fact. We've tried to objectify it by giving you something called the intelligence quotient, the IQ test. But does that really reflect human intelligence? We now talk about things like emotional intelligence, the ability to empathize, right? So that's not an objective fact. What is an objective fact? You're a convicted felon. If I say that, right, we can objectively verify that. Do you have a criminal record? Yes or no? If that's false and it's objectively, then you may have a cause of action in tort, not in criminal law, but in tort. So the law is important, but there are all kinds of things that are part of the law that may or may not have ethical import. So this field where they overlap makes the law important. But what about if the law itself is immoral? So a lot of textbooks say that the law is an acceptable moral minimum. What about in the United States before we got the civil rights amendments and civil rights legislation? The fact that African Americans were, to begin with, not citizens. They were enslaved people. And then once they were freed as a result of the Civil War and 3 amendments that we get to the United States Constitution, the 14th, which contains one of 2 due process clauses in the document, the 13th frees the former slaves, the 14th Amendment gives them due process, and the 15th Amendment grants free men, the right to vote, not women. Women didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Is that moral? That we disenfranchise? There are more women in the population usually than there are men. Why is that? Well, every year at birth, there are roughly equal numbers of men and women babies. But by the time you get to be teenagers, there are slightly more females. Why? Because men have a tendency to engage in stupid behavior, risky behavior, like bull riding. One of my favorite sports. I'm the vice mayor in Guthrie, Oklahoma. You know what started in Guthrie, Oklahoma? The PBR. Started at the Lazy E Arena. It's at an event called Bull Nanza. So when I was a kid growing up, rodeo events included a bull riding event, but there were a whole series. And then they decided, like Eddie Gaylord, I guess, who owned the Lazy E, decided, well, hey, we could make an entire event out of this one thing, bull riding. And they do. It's a great way to die. Get on the back of a 2,000-pound animal, and see what happens. Not real smart. A lot of fun. Great way to end your life. Or end up horribly maimed, right? So there are slightly more women than there are men in our population. And forever and ever and ever, we excluded them from the political process until we get to the 19th Amendment, right? So the law itself may be immoral. after the Civil War, we had all of these codes which excluded people on the basis of their skin color from voting. And how did they do it? Well, they had clauses in the voting laws of the South that said you couldn't vote unless your grandfather could vote. That excluded everybody who had been formerly a slave. They had poll taxes. They had all of these ways of excluding. So the law may itself be immoral. It's an important consideration. We have to think about the law when we think about morality and ethics, but it may itself be immoral. And so we have to think about it. It's an important consideration. But what if the law itself is immoral? During the 1950s and 60s, it was illegal for Black people to eat at food counters in restaurants in the South. That's immoral. That was the law. The law was immoral, right? So it's important that we think about this, but it's not necessarily mutually exclusive or exclusive. So there's an overlap in the law and ethics. What would constitute a moral minimum is one of the things that we will talk about in this class when we talk about philosophical ethics. That's a good place to stop because I can't get through the next chapter on the ethical theories. If you feel cheated because I'm letting you go a little bit early, you let me know and we'll stay late next Tuesday. If you got ducks, come and see me and I will give you your bonus points for today.